Hi, this is Shreyashi Dasgupta. I'm a lecturer in critical social and political geography here at the University of Liverpool, and you are listening to the Developing Practice podcast.
In this podcast episode, Shreyashi Dasgupta shares her reflections around the challenges and benefits of doing field-based research as a new mother. She draws on both her own personal experiences and what she learned from interviewing fellow researcher mothers as part of a recent scholarship project. Hello, and welcome to this podcast. And before we launch into the topic more deeply, could you just say a little bit about your journey and what's brought you to where you are today as a lecturer at Liverpool?
Yes, thank you for having me here today. And I'm really happy to share about my research and about myself. I'm originally from Kolkata in India, and I have lived and worked in Mumbai for several years, and then moved to the UK in 2014. Feel like it's been a long time since then to pursue my MPhil degree, and then I subsequently continued for the PhD program both at the University of Cambridge, followed by a postdoctoral position in geography as a part of the ESRC postdoctoral fellowship. And after completing that fellowship, really, I moved to the University of Liverpool in 2022, where I currently teach human geography at the Department of Geography and Planning.
You recently completed, you talk about geography as your discipline, but you recently completed a research project specifically around motherhood in academia. And I wonder what motivated you to take on that particular aspect.
Yeah, I mean, several bits, motivated me to explore this topic. My research over the years have predominantly been fieldwork based, and I have worked mainly in two countries, India and Bangladesh. And my interests are in areas of urban housing, migration, infrastructure, governance, and climate change. And I feel like all of these strands are somewhere tied together by my kind of consistent interest and focus on questions related to care and justice. Fieldwork has been an important part of my work, but also in the discipline of geography, where we hear about different kinds of field work, field research, there's field based teaching, there's pilot visits that we often do, there's networking and coordination related visits. And so I feel like when I refer to fieldwork in our conversation, I am drawing on from the field based research in this context because that's where my insights are drawn from. A lot of meaningful conversations, I mean, were generated as a part of the interdisciplinary research group that I was a part of at the University of Cambridge. It was called Women and Fieldwork in South Asia. It was an interdisciplinary collaboration with my colleagues, Rebecca Roberts and Afifa Khan, where we kind of hosted several conversations, seminars, and workshops on what it meant to be a woman conducting field work. And I feel like my interest continued in that sort of a methodological and intersectional understanding of what the field is. Finally, what motivated me to do this particular project was my own positionality of being a mother. My daughter, Ida, was born in 2023 when I was working on grant proposals and planning for my fieldwork and research. And I think the circumstances thereafter of doing research changed completely, and that motivated me to have these conversations about academic mothers and how do they access and engage with the field.
And I guess there's a wider context here as well of where those conversations are happening.
Yes, yeah, that's very true. I mean, like I was saying that, fieldwork is an important part for several disciplines, and geography is just probably one of them, right? So the kind of link between fieldwork and curriculum is also an important one because contemporary discourse on where higher education is today and just consistent focus on research led teaching in higher education. So, on one hand, research led teaching in research intensive universities widely promote the need to enhance student learning and promote deeper engagement with knowledge. But that discourse comes with other layered understanding of student outcomes, institutional reputation, global rankings, and all of those kind of plays with it. At the same time, it overlooks the lived realities of those who enact these practices, that is, the academic staff, and particularly early career women and mothers. So, in my work, I'm interested in understanding how field work is shaped by caring responsibilities and how can we really generate collective reflections on how do we make do research-led teaching in geography but also in allied disciplines.
And you said you kind of dove into this as you became a mother yourself, planning fieldwork, planning grant applications as a new mother. So how did that experience shape the way you approached those grant applications?
It was a very different experience, something that I constantly grappled with each time I was thinking and planning of field work. And I was always confronted with the same kind of logistical question, how do I manage my travel across multiple cities in India at that time when I had to do my field research, and what sort of support do I rely on? How do I, like, basically, where do I even start from? And I didn't know much individuals or resources that I could get help from. So I feel like, transitioning back into my role from the maternity leave and then easing into the whole process of doing research and field work again felt like it was quite something to be planned.
It sounds like it made the fieldwork planning just infinitely bigger and more complex than it maybe was before. For me, the temptation would have been to just go, oh, it's too difficult and not bother doing fieldwork, but you pushed through and you did actually complete your fieldwork as part of your research.
Yes, absolutely. And that, was my experience, but also in my research, that became an experience of all my respondents that I spoke to. And some of them did highlight, which was a very important theme that came out of my work, was about the need for good support system and good support networks. And when I had those conversations with my respondents, each one of them understood that kind of support system and network very differently, and it played out differently for their own circumstances. There were constant references to researchers being present and absent on the field, and one of my respondents, for instance, shared how collaboration and short-term overseas field work was always a part of her research, but that became dependent on availability of reliable care. And as one would imagine, especially doing field work abroad, finding these ad hoc care becomes really difficult. And for one of my respondent, without any family nearby or a suitable childcare option abroad, those extended field trips required a lot of complex kind of negotiations and A very good example here was when my respondent said that her 6-month-old son was accompanying her to all the meetings, which really worked well for the meetings. But that also meant that she missed a lot out on the networking dinners and the conversations that happens in the corridors and the social paths really that actually sustain research. And she described that kind of rare moment of integration when she was presenting her research to a community. Her son was sitting nearby. So, in a way, that reinforced her commitment to navigating both these roles as a researcher and as a mother. And I feel like that kind of thought echoed quite strongly amongst all of us having faced similar kind of circumstances about at what point are we present as a researcher and what point are we there as a mother, and how do those roles kind of blur from time to time while doing field work.
It's interesting. It's making me kind of think back at when I was young and my mum was doing field work with my grandmother, so her mother-in-law, in tow as childcare while she was going out interviewing for field work. My mum talks about that as being, yeah, like you say, juggling different roles and negotiating care, negotiating support, but being grateful to have that support nearby. Your fieldwork is international as well, so traveling abroad, does that mean you're now far away from support, or how does that work for you?
This was an interesting kind of finding in the research that for some of the respondents and in my own circumstances really we had some kind of family support, but for some there was that support was not an option just because they had family living elsewhere and it was a huge distance and so on. There is that element of flexibility depending on what kind of support system one would have at that point. Yeah, most of my respondents relied on that question about what happens when in one country you might have your family as a support system, but what happens if you were to research in a completely different country and your future projects might take you to another location. It could be within the UK, it could be elsewhere in the world, but the question remains the same about navigating these challenges in different ways. And also, I think a cultural context came out quite strongly in my research, where respondents said cultural dynamics of fieldwork is interesting about how you are also perceived in the communities that you are doing research. If you were to take your child or if you were to leave your child behind, you are equally faced with that kind of questioning, I suppose, about what's acceptable in a more kind of cultural context about doing field work as a mother differs from that one context to the other.
Yeah, and I feel like sometimes you can't win either way. If you bring the child, that's not considered appropriate, but if you leave the child behind, that's not considered appropriate either. Yeah, it's a challenging balancing act, and you have to know where it is you're working to make that work.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
You also kind of talk about the financial implications of caring responsibilities alongside fieldwork. Could you say a little bit about that as well?
Yeah, I think financial challenges was definitely a big theme that emerged from this research. I can share my own experience here when I was doing field work in Mumbai and Chennai in India with my daughter, who at that time was 1 year old. My fieldwork preparations really began from the airport itself, trying to book the right kind of flight with manageable layovers, arranging paperwork for the airports, choosing the right kind of seats suitable for traveling with the child, packing all kind of essentials to care for during the journey. There were additional costs at every step: flights, baggage, transport, car seats, last mile connections, and that the cost of field work started even before I reached the field. And when I requested my parents and my husband to kind of adjust their schedule to support me, their travel, accommodation, and logistical expenses was significant. My parents had to put their work and responsibilities on hold in Kolkata to care for my daughter during my research. And sometimes these costs were unpredictable as well. For instance, when my daughter fell ill during field work, we had to do multiple hospital visits and the doctors. So yes, financial challenges became a major point of conversations with my participants, and it made all of us think about who truly can afford to do field work or who has the privilege to do field work, and how do we negotiate these financial realities with our funders and institutions. I did look up a couple of funding policies around the UK and realized that different UK institutions have different policies, often one where childcare is a non-allowable expenses during research.
That question about who can afford to or who has the support network to do field work, I guess that could end up changing the field, the geography of the field, the what kind of research get done, what kind of research questions get asked by excluding some people from fieldwork or including others from fieldwork.
Absolutely. I feel like this changes the dynamics. It is true, of course, for geography, but like I was saying, for probably multiple other disciplines where similar kinds of challenges might be there. So it changes the dynamics. Although even after having done this research, I do have to say that there are certain best practices that I have seen and which I feel needs to be mentioned. One of the work being done by the Development Geographies Research Group at the Royal Geographical Society, their advocacy has pushed for the recognition that travel funding should acknowledge and support caring responsibilities, including childcare. And, they have published a gold standard of funding, which is really useful and hopes like one would imagine that that would be model for other funding and other institutions to follow. The second best practice would be the British Academy has recently started something within which one could claim or ask for support related to childcare related costs. So these are the only two examples and initiatives that I've seen during my research, but I would love to kind of hear more about other funding bodies and other funders and institutions about how they support the work that's happening in the discipline of geography, but also more widely. Something that I don't quite talk about in my own work is what does it mean for parenting more broadly for both fathers and mothers? Because in this pilot piece of work, I focused on looking at mothers, which was based on, my own positionality of being one. But there are a lot of other dimension that also shapes the question and how it might frame these things for the discipline of geography moving forward. Yeah, it's a very important conversation that needs to be discussed more widely.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a really important conversation to have. And it's heartening to know that there are at least some attempts to create best practice policies. I hope we can get those conversations going further. We've talked a lot about the challenges of doing field work as a new mother. Was there anything that you think was a particularly benefit or positive aspect of doing field work as a mother?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I feel like most conversations that I had during this process highlighted about building collaborations during this process, and also researchers who took their kids along during field work felt like there was kind of that exposure of taking the child to the field and learning from different cultures and incorporating and embedding that learning in their fieldwork. For me, the positive aspect was I learned how to incorporate some of these learning in my own curriculum and teaching on research methods. And how do I incorporate these kind of questions of positionality into my teaching when I teach the students on doing research methods. And I would say these were definitely some of the positive bits discussed, that you can engage in international projects, build collaborations, and continue doing research in a particular way.
Nice to hear that there are some positives as well, and it's that connection to your teaching as well is really interesting, that it helps inform how you teach about doing research, not just doing your own research. Just to wrap up this conversation, I wonder if you could give some, based on what you've learned, some recommendations to colleagues who are new mothers or expecting to become mothers soon. What would you recommend in terms of navigating fieldwork and research?
This is my recommendation, but also based on all the kind of wider conversation that's happening in the field by several other researchers talking on similar lines about constantly doing advocacy around funding bodies and institutions to recognize childcare and dependent care as like a legitimate research related costs, and explicitly allowing these expenses in grant applications. So I would recommend kind of new mothers to think that that's a possibility, which probably I did not think of when I was starting, my research journey after becoming a mother, and I didn't know where to start these things from. The second thing is, this is again another point on advocacy, probably more voices coming together in thinking about creating some kind of dedicated funding pots to provide support, enabling researchers to participate fully in fieldwork collaborations and international projects, which currently seems to be missing in an institutional context. There seem to be no such places where one could apply for these grants. Of course, like I said, the British Academy has these, and probably a couple of more funders, but also encouraging institutions to developing their own best practices around it. The third would be, making all these informations easily accessible and clearly published on websites, rather than requiring researchers to email funders or institutions on an ad hoc basis and rely on their case by case decisions. Often when I was kind of navigating this, I found it very hard to access this information on public platforms, because it's often hidden somewhere, and the onus is on us as researchers to find those information. So yeah, like these kind of recommendations might reduce some sort of potential barriers for early career researchers and mothers, and it might help support their progression from coming back from maternity into the whole research process.
Thank you. Some really good suggestions there. And just to say thank you again for sharing your experiences and what you've learned from your project, and wish you all the best of luck with your continued research and fieldwork.
Thank you so much. This was a good conversation, and thank you for giving me the time and space to sharing more about my work. Thank you.